Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining HCC's third webinar, Exploring the Pursuit of Effective Public Health Policies Through a Trade Lens. My name is Maisha Hutton. I'm the Executive Director of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. This is the third webinar in the Childhood Obesity Prevention webinar series, a series that consists of webinars intended to build the capacity of civil society organizations and other key stakeholders advocating for and implementing childhood obesity prevention policies in the region. We are very pleased to have today presenting this webinar Mrs. Nicole Foster. She's HCC's policy advisor and champion. She is an attorney at law and recently appointed Deputy Dean of Law at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. The objective of this webinar is to sensitize public health policymakers to the relevance and implications of international trade rules for formulation and implementation of public health policy at the national level. I now welcome Mrs. Foster.
Thank you, Maisha, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. So as Maisha indicated, I'm going to be speaking today about how we can effectively pursue public health policies, bearing in mind the trade environment. And that's important because, as we know, as we go through a processes of liberalization in the context of WTO and otherwise, what we see is the possibility of increased availability of unhealthy food and services. And the question, therefore, is what is the scope for public health policymakers to still regulate what happens in terms of those types of goods and services that they would really prefer that they either be limited or no access to by their populations. So this is just quickly the three main areas that we're going to be covering, and I'll just jump straight in. So just to give you a very brief overview of really what we're talking about when we're talking about the multilateral trading system and the WTO. What is its underpinnings? And basically, the key elements that underpin the WTO system are that we have tariff binding, so there's certain tariff levels that we've committed that we will not increase in terms of the goods and services that are coming within our territory. And then we have most favored nation treatment and national treatment, which together basically say, as a state, I am not going to discriminate between WTO members, but also between domestic goods and foreign goods as it relates to access to my market. And then finally, the World Trade Organization, the last principle or pillar would be the idea that the multilateral trading system frowns upon quantitative restrictions. They don't like bans and restrictions on access, limiting access to your market. And from that point of view, therefore, you would understand that since in many instances, when we're thinking about public health measures, we'd be thinking about either restricting or banning access to certain goods, you would understand how we would be in the realm of wondering, well, what does the WTO regime say about this? So when we're talking about health in the context of the WTO, there are a few key agreements that really sort of most prominently deal with health issues. For the purposes of this webinar, my presentation is just going to focus on the general exceptions clauses in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the Agreement on Technical Barriers, and the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, which are the main focus of many of the types of measures that we would be seeking to be put in place in terms of our work in terms of childhood obesity prevention. So, just to give you a broad sense of what those provisions, what the general exceptions clause in the WTO provides. So basically, what the general exceptions clause in the WTO says is, notwithstanding all of these rules that we have, as I just outlined in terms of not discriminating and not having quantitative restrictions, etc., it says, notwithstanding those rules, there's certain limited instances in which you're able to violate those principles to pursue a particular value, which we also recognize as being important. And in that regard, what it allows for is what would be otherwise WTO inconsistent measures, provided that they are, one, necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, and are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or a disguised restriction on international trade. And so health, as you would see, is a specific one of the exceptions to the overall WTO rules. There are other ones, but obviously we're just focused on the health one. And in that regard, there's a lot of case law within the WTO which sort of basically fleshes out what do we mean in the context of something being necessary, and what do we mean by arbitrary unjustifiable discrimination. But I'm not going to delay here in terms of that case law, because in fact what we have found is that in the context of the recent discussions under the TBT agreement, much of the jurisprudence that relates to Article 20 and Article of GATT and Article 14 of GATT has been pulled into the TBT agreement. So my discussion, I'm going to focus a little bit more on TBT, just because that tends to be the agreement as a specific agreement that is more in focus, would be more the one that would be to be applied. But at the same time, much of the jurisprudence, it would be consistent at the same time with what would be the approach if we were just applying the general exceptions clause. All right, so the starting point, the first really important thing to note about the TBT agreement is that which is the technical barriers to trade. And the TBT agreement in its preamble recognizes that members have a right to implement measures to protect health at the level they consider appropriate, provided that those measures aren't applied in a manner that amounts to an arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade. And you will see right there why I said that it's not necessary to spend too much time on the jurisprudence of the GATT, because you see basically the TBT agreement has lifted much of that language and put it in the specific context of technical barriers to trade. So the reasoning and understanding of those provisions would be pretty much the same. Now, when we're dealing with the TBT agreement, that agreement deals with a specific category of measures, and those would be what we call technical regulations. And there's a specific definition for technical regulations that's set out in the TBT agreement. And that says it's a document which lays down product characteristics or the related processes with which compliance is mandatory. So, for example, some schemes, such as mandatory front of pack labeling schemes, because they would be setting out the characteristics that how the packaging has to look and would be mandatory, that would be considered a technical regulation and therefore would fall within the scope of the TBT agreement. The other general provision in terms of the TBT agreement as it relates to health that is important to bear in mind is that even though the preamble does recognize and preserve member states' rights to take action in relation to health, it says that those regulations should not be more trade restrictive than necessary to fulfill a legitimate objective, taking account of the risk non-fulfillment would create. So the idea is you're not giving a blank check in the context of what you can do in terms of health. It says, okay, you're acting within a trade regime. So even though we allow you to take health measures, what we require of you is that you do it in the least trade restrictive way possible, bearing in mind the risk of non-fulfillment. And usefully for these purposes, Article 2.2 of the TBT agreement specifically identifies the protection of human health or safety as one of the legitimate objectives which member states are able to take action in relation to. The other basic point to bear in mind in terms of the TBT agreement is that there is a rebuttable presumption that a technical regulation does not create an unnecessary obstacle to international trade if it falls within the scope of one of the explicitly mentioned legitimate objectives, in our case, public health, and is in accordance with relevant international standards. And this is important just purely from an evidentiary point of view. You would appreciate that it means that you have less to prove. If it is that I have based my technical regulation on an existing international standard, a recognized international standard, it means now I don't have to make the case that my measures is consistent. It's presumed to be WTO consistent, and it would really be now for the other side to prove what about it that makes it WTO inconsistent. So it makes your job a little bit easier as a health policy maker if there are existing international standards on which you are based your measure, because then the presumption would be the measure is consistent with the WTO. Note, however, in this regard, that it is a rebuttable presumption. So it's not an absolute determination. The presumption would be that it is consistent, but it would be then open for the other side to prove what about it they think is in fact inconsistent with the WTO agreement. So, in terms of what I've just been saying, basically, you would see that there seems to be quite a bit of policy sphere in the context of what it is you're able to do as a health policy maker in the context of trade, because we have said that notwithstanding the trade rules which limit the ability to impose higher tariffs and limit the ability to discriminate and limit the ability to impose bans and other quantitative restrictions through agreements such as the TBT agreement, as well as the general exceptions clause of the general agreement on tariffs and trade and the general agreement on trade and services, we see that there is recognition and allowance to be able to take measures once they are able to be justified on public health grounds and are the least trade restrictive possible. So then you might say, so what's all the concern that persons have then about health? Am I being unduly optimistic about my reading of the TBT agreement? And this is where the very important case of the WTO tobacco plain packaging dispute comes in. As you would recall, a few years ago, Australia, as one of the leaders in the area of tobacco control, had implemented plain packaging measures, basically as part of their tobacco control measures, and it was challenging the WTO. And Australia sought to justify those measures, so they were considered to be a technical barrier to trade, a technical regulation, and so had to be assessed under the agreement. And in that regard, you would recall that Australia was ultimately able to satisfy the WTO panel that, in fact, the measures they had taken were consistent with the obligations that they had under the WTO, so that public health in that context was able to win out. And so I just want to quickly touch on some of the key lessons that we derive from that plain packaging case that would sort of highlight and reinforce to you the types of considerations that you have to bear in mind as policymakers in constructing public health policies that you wish to avoid having problems with in terms of trade challenges. I'm just going to, in interest of time, just skip over a few slides and just go to a summary slide that I have here, which is the lessons learned from the tobacco case. And there are a number of important lessons that we can derive from the case. So yeah, tobacco is not always necessarily 100% identifiable with the types of measures that one might want to take in terms of regulating environments as it relates to food. But there's still some important interpretations and approaches that were articulated by the panel that would be of general application and would be important for policymakers in the area of public health in mind. The first lesson that we learn in the context of sort of properly exploiting the policy space within the WTO agreements, whether it's on the GATT, GATS, or the TBT agreement, is that you have to have a clearly defined public policy objective. In Australia's case, that was clear. They were trying to reduce exposure to and the power of the tobacco marketing within their territory. Clearly, in that regard, so in articulating your policy objective, you would want to ensure that you have the necessary evidence, the public health policymaker, to substantiate that this is in fact a matter of health. And then the other consideration that is important to bear in mind is that framing is important. We tend to have there's a tendency on the part of health policymakers to be overly ambitious in their statement of the objective. And the idea is that that objective is going to be the frame of reference for everything else that you do in terms of the determination of whether you have met the WTO rules or not. So the higher you set the ambition is the more you will have to prove. So really what you want to do is set short, concrete, measurable, and achievable objectives. So for example, if we're dealing with something like front-of-pack labeling, which is part of the measures that we're trying to put in place in terms of combating, dealing with the problem of obesity and its linkage to chronic non-communicable diseases, the objective is not to reduce obesity, or the objective is not to reduce the NCD levels. That's our long-term, down the road big vision. But really the specific objective that one would have in the context of FOPL would be something like empowering consumers to make better choices, to make more informed choices, helping consumers understand what are the types of nutrients that are in their food. Because those are the types of objectives that you can measure, can clearly identify, and can provide evidence that would substantiate it. So that's quite important. The other lesson that we need to bear in mind is that you have to have evidence of the contribution of the measure to your stated public health objective. Because remember that TBT and GATT more broadly will require you to take the least trade restrictive approach to dealing with the problem. You have to show that in terms of this measure that you have identified, that there's in fact a connection between the goal you have stated, the objective you have stated, and the measure that you're trying to put in place. So if, for example, you would need, in the context of front-of-pack labeling, we know we have quite a bit of evidence that's coming out showing how front-of-pack labeling, as opposed to high-end warning label type systems, as opposed to other systems, are helping consumers make better choices. So that would be the type of evidence that you would need to lead. The other very important thing to bear in mind as a policymaker is, and I think this is an area where we in the Caribbean may be a little bit weak on, is that one of the strengths of Australia's position in the context of the tobacco case was that plain packaging was not a standalone measure. Plain packaging, recognizing that tobacco control and the problems related with cancer and NCDs more broadly as it relates to consumption of tobacco, recognizing that that's a multi-pronged problem, they had a multi-pronged response. And therefore, in terms of showing the contribution of the measure to their overall objectives, they were able to show that I don't have to rely on this alone. So I'm going to show you some evidence that, plain packaging is going to help. But I'm not suggesting that plain packaging alone is going to turn the page. But when combined with these other things, then we're going to see some movement in that regard. And that was quite important for the panel because there was some limited evidence. Australia didn't necessarily have the most powerful evidence on everything, every aspect of the arguments that they were making in relation to plain packaging. But what they were able to say, even though we don't have fully all the evidence here, what we can show you is how all of these things work together, and when all of these things work together, they're going to get us where we need to be. The other important point, lesson coming out of the tobacco case is the whole concept of how do we determine whether a measure is less trade restrictive? How do we determine whether or not it would meet that test. And in that regard, the important thing to bear in mind is, even though industry or an opponent of your public health policy might be able to identify an alternative that is less trade restrictive, unless that alternative is reasonably available in the sense of financially, technologically, logistically feasible for you to implement, and also importantly will have equivalent contribution to the achievement of your public health goal. Unless they can prove all of that, they would not be able to trump your measure. Equally, and once again, as I said, this is a really important part of the whole discussion, where you have multi-pronged approaches to a problem. So a suite of measures that is attempting to address one problem, it then becomes a little bit more difficult for the other side to say that there's a reasonably available alternative. Because what the panel said in tobacco was that, well, but this is a multi-pronged strategy. So you can't just substitute one element of that strategy and say, well, it addresses the whole problem. Because clearly the problem requires a multitude of responses. For that regard, in that regard, we couldn't allow you to make the argument that in fact there are other less trade restrictive alternatives on the table. And then the last two quickly are quite obvious. The non-discriminatory nature. Obviously, you are genuinely about a public health problem. You would know that it would be that you can't discriminate. So whatever exceptions that you're making in the context of this policy that you're trying to put in play, what you would want to ensure as a public health policy maker is that those exceptions have some rational connection to what it is you're trying to achieve, that you can justify that this isn't really part of the problem, and therefore that's why I left it out. Or if you're discriminating between one type of product and another type of product, you can say, well, there's a legitimate regulatory distinction between the two. I don't know, free sugar. I'm not a public health, I'm not a doctor. So like free sugars don't operate in the same way as other types of sugar. And therefore, that's why maybe we, would want to nuance the way in which we approach the products that have those different types of sugars. And then in terms of due process, sort of across the board and obvious in that you clearly have to have open, transparent processes, because WTO does require you to notify members of what's happening, give them an opportunity to comment, and you really have to demonstrate that you've gone through a robust process of consultation where all the players, health and non-health, have had an opportunity to have their voice heard and taken account of. And notwithstanding that, when you put it all together, you have still determined that this measure is the best measure in terms of the most effective measure that is the least trade restrictive to achieve the policy goal that you have in mind. So that's WTO and its rules in the context of GATT, GATS, and TBT, but really just revolving around the public health exception within the WTO, because broadly that's the common theme there, the idea that we can take public health measures, put in place public health measures that on the face of them may violate WTO rules, but can be justified based on the exceptions contained either between GATT, GATS, or the TBT agreement. But the webinar, in addition to sort of highlighting the policy space that's available there in the context of the WTO, we also wanted to draw persons' attention in particular to the problem of and need for greater policy coherence. Because it doesn't matter if we go in the WTO and we, better understanding all the flexibilities there, we create some great policy that, is able to withstand challenge in the context of the WTO, but then aren't necessarily following that through in our other forums. And so one important forum in that regard is, of course, the Codex Alimentarius, is a joint body under the United Nations of FAO and WHO. So the member states of those bodies would basically be also members of the Codex. And the importance of Codex in terms of policy making from a health perspective is that for the most part, the Codex standards that are generated would qualify as international standards and therefore would be the types of rules that if you implemented a policy based on it, you would have an easier chance, easier experience in terms of justifying your measure because of the fact that the presumption would be that it's WTO consistent. So bearing in mind that we're talking about the need for policy coherence, you may say, well, since FAO and since Codex is already dealing with issues of front of pack labeling and you know, trying to deal with some of these issues, doesn't it make it inconsistent then for us to be trying to push maybe our schemes are to push an agenda, for example, in the context of the WTO, where we're trying to get support for a certain type of front-of-pack labeling scheme or other technical regulations that we may have in play. And the idea is that it's important to bear in mind, and there's a tendency on the part of industry to really overemphasize role and the implications of Codex. Codex is there for us to have a minimum level from which we operate, some level of harmonization. It is not intended to set the ceiling. It is not intended that once there is a Codex standard, it means no member state can ever go above what was agreed. And so in that regard, you know, there's still scope for you in the context of your public health goals to the extent that you feel whatever international standards are there do not adequately address the concerns that you have in terms of your particular public health concerns, then it would still be open to you to implement a policy that maybe goes above Codex requires. What would be critical there, however, of course, would be that you have the evidence to support why it is necessary to go above the standard, because the assumption is, okay, we have a standard, maybe that should work. So if you want to not use the standard, you would really, as a health policymaker, want to ensure that you have the evidence supporting why further action is needed over and above what you are already doing in the context of the standard. And just specifically on FO front of pack labeling, just to note that the work there in Codex is very much at its infancy, so there's not a sense in which we actually have an international standard. And so it's very much an open space in which persons can continue to do what they want to do in terms of working on the particular type of scheme that they need to have in the context of their public health objectives. But all the while, and this is where the coherence comes in, we would want to ensure that as CARICOM and other countries with an interest in this issue, that we participate actively in the processes within Codex, because we would want to ensure that whatever we're saying in the WTO and whatever other forums as it relates to our public health objectives, that we're also saying the same thing in the context of the Codex. Inter-policy coherence more broadly, of course, is not just Codex. We have the PAHO WHO, so CARICOM for sure. We have a strong representation. We're normally well represented at PAHO and WHO. We give strong representation to the different positions that are taken there. But the challenge is, how do we translate that outside of PAHO and WHO? And so this is where the sorts of governance structures that we have in place in terms of interministerial and interministry communication become key. So it's not so much that PAHO and WHO will be undermining what we're trying to do in terms of our public health. In fact, they inform much of what we're doing, but the idea is, how do we get coherence with their agenda in terms of the other fora? And in terms of UNCTAD, WIPO, and the UN human rights processes more broadly, it's the same idea. So in the context of UNCTAD, less so, health would not necessarily come up very prominently in the context of UNCTAD, but the idea would be, to the extent that we are discussing issues as it relates to liberalization and otherwise, and how the limits that we're going to put on states' ability to regulate what is going on within their borders, we would want to ensure that the positions we're taking are consistent with the types of policies that we would want to see in place. And similarly with WIPO. So this webinar didn't really focus on, I didn't speak to IP. There are a few of the slides that I didn't go into that have a little bit of information about IP, intellectual property, but the idea is that a lot of what goes on in the intellectual property field has implications for health. And so it's important that we realize that all of these entities, all of these organizations that are out there, even though they don't have health formally as part of their mandate, in fact have an important impact on what you have to do as policymakers, and therefore it's important to ensure that you have continuous dialogue on these issues, specifically as it relates to intellectual property. You would know, for example, intellectual property can impact on issues as it relates to access to medicines, but also as it relates to patented drugs, etc., but also to in the plain packaging case, for example, Philip Morris attempted to say that plain packaging violated their rights under the TRIPS agreement as it relates to their trademark. So they were trying to argue that there is a positive right that you have in a trademark, a positive right to be able to display your trademark, as opposed to just a negative right to prevent others from copying your trademark. And so they said, insofar as the plain packaging now removes much of the trademarks that they would have had, it would have created a violation of the TRIPS agreement. And that argument was soundly and wrongly rejected. But once again, it would be important that when we're having discussions about trademarks in the context of WIPO or even the TRIPS Council in the context of the WTO, that member states take positions and continue that discussion in terms of ensuring that we don't then end up in a position where member states say, well, there's some positive right to display a trademark as opposed to it just concerning negative rights. And then finally, in terms of policy coherence and maybe sort of spaces where we need to better leverage and connect as public health policymakers, we have the United Nations Human Rights regime and their processes. And our member states actively participate, relatively actively participate. We do put in our reports, etc., in terms of the different human rights processes, and certainly as it relates to childhood obesity, it's important to note that every single of us in CARICOM has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and therefore would have obligations in terms of reporting and implementation of that agreement. And there, what we want to ensure is that we are having, as public health policymakers, inputs into what is being said in those processes and into the priorities that are being created in terms of implementation, so that we ensure that we stay on track in terms of how we're going, in terms of achievement of our public health goals more broadly. Now, having said that, I'm not, overly naive. I spent 6 years of my life as counselor in the Barbados mission to Geneva, to the WTO in Geneva. So I know we have real constraints, and policy coherence is not always as easy to achieve as it may seem. And certainly, up front, one of the major constraints that we have are limited resources, both financial and technical. Having said that, I don't know that it has to be insurmountable, but I recognize that it's a problem, and it's particularly a problem because with those limited resources, it means that our opponents or industry more broadly may be able to say, oh, you can't do that. And because we don't feel we have the capacity to really investigate or to know for sure whether we can or not, we just abandon the policy because we said, well, we can't take the chance that it might be consistent, let us say, for example, with the WTO. So there's a potential regulatory chill that can come into play in terms of those limited resources. In terms of constraints, another constraint is inadequate, and I referenced this in passing earlier, is inadequate coordination and information sharing between and among ministries and overseas missions and embassies. Have been in a mission myself, I know that oftentimes ministries don't necessarily fully appreciate what a powerful tool they have in the missions, and don't necessarily see the missions as part of foreign affairs, which they are. They are part of foreign affairs, but they're there as an arm of the Barbados government and to articulate the positions that want part that that the government has determined need to be put on behalf of the country. And in that regard, really important if the mission staff and embassy staff understand the underpinnings of the policies that you want implemented, so they understand what has informed them, etc. So in their interactions with others, they're able to better sell, but also to get a better sense of what might be some of the problems that we need to anticipate and try to deal with going forward. And then obviously the last constraint, which is related to the first, is that we do have a lead presence on the ground in some of the fora. United Nations, we're pretty well represented, but the other ones less so. But so that obviously calls for some creative thinking in terms of how we leverage the resources that we do have. So in terms of moving forward, I think, as I said, I don't think that any of those constraints that I have articulated need to be fatal. I think they're all overcomable, for lack of a better word. I think we can have better coordination and sharing of information. I don't think it's beyond us in the region to put systems in place so that we talk to each other better. Unfortunately, many of our, sort of as a default, many of the processes tend to be informal. But from my point of view, informal is better than nothing. So we would certainly want to have formal processes, but I would encourage those of you public health policymakers to make sure you know who's in the mission that deals with, tobacco control, who's in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that deals with tobacco control, who deals with, NCD's issues, who covers the Sixth Committee in the United Nations dealing with legal issues, who covers human rights in the UN, in New York, and in Geneva. And obviously, affairs will have, and each ministry will have the formal processes, how you have to interact and how information needs to flow. But at least if you know who's dealing with those things, you at least know somebody who you can call when there's a problem, or they can call you to say XYZ meeting is coming up. We sent something into the PS. Please make sure that they follow up. You can also have the leveraging of the missions, as I said. Certainly when I was still in the Barbados mission, we had the experience when we were dealing with trips on public health, where we had a very fruitful and useful interaction and leveraging of the mission in the context of between our ministry that was responsible for intellectual property and our ministry that was responsible for drugs, so the drug service, and then of course our foreign trade division. So they were using us and in a very effective way to sort of feed information in and out. And we were able, coming out of that whole process, we actually managed to get ComSec to use Barbados as a case study for work relating to access to medicines. But that all started with a conversation with the mission and trying and just indicating from a capital point of view that this was really an important issue, and we needed to see how we could leverage the available resources to see how we could push Barbados's position forward. More broadly, in terms of improving our participation and engagement in multilateral on the multilateral front, it's also important to pay attention to the composition of delegations. And I know that is not something that policymakers within health necessarily have control over, but it's certainly something that you need to continue to advocate for, that delegations that go up. So TBT committee, if front-of-part labeling is being discussed, it shouldn't just be, for example, Standards Bureau that has input or Standards Bureau that may be going. Maybe you would want to say, well, we would want health to have some sort of an input. Make sure that health has an input into this because there's a strong health perspective on these issues, or even taxation or something like that. That is a strong health perspective that we would want taken account of as we put together our formal positions to our respective ministries of foreign trade, etc. And then, of course, there's always the alliance building, right? Alliance building in terms of like-minded states. So for example, right now, we know in CARICOM, we are very much in a space where we are looking at implementing front-of-pack labeling, that sort of has the high-end label. So let's look around and see who else has those types of systems. In terms of taxation, we know Mexico, we know a number of other countries have successfully implemented taxation regimes. And so, you know, you can build those relationships on an issue-by-issue basis. So it's not every issue that you necessarily have common interest, but you can build those alliances, and then it means you have the additional power of those countries and those additional numbers. And then also we need to not forget the importance of the partners that we have more broadly, our partners in civil society. We know that important work is taking place in the context of work with Bloomberg Philanthropies and Global Advocacy Incubator, and they obviously have resources that many times maybe we can't duplicate, and we need to leverage those. We have resources within PAHO and WHO who have been enormously valuable, and you will see in one of the slides that I skipped in the context of the discussion on the plain packaging case, that actually the FCTC Secretariat and WHO played a critical role in pretty much everything that the panel determined. They were so strongly influenced by the evidence that was brought by the FCTC Secretariat in terms of why what Australia was doing was important and would be effective. And even though we didn't have all the evidence yet, everyone pointed to that this would be effective. And so, you know, we all belong to these organizations, and their expertise and resources are at our disposal. And so we have to always remember that in the context of, you know, recognizing that we have some constraints, both financial and technical, in terms of our ability to deal with many issues. And so just to conclude then, the message that I wanted to leave with you as policymakers in the area of public health, precisely because trade is so often mischaracterized as an insurmountable barrier to your ability to put in place the types of policies that you would want to put in place to secure the health of your nation. The comment that I wanted to end with was this. Even though we don't have a blank check in terms of what we can and cannot do in the context of public health as it relates to the World Trade Organization, WTO rules are not a barrier to implementing effective, bona fide public health policies. I have nutrition policies here in schools, but it's public health policies more broadly. Once a measure is legitimately bona fide a public health measure, which means to say you have the evidence, you have the science, you've explored the alternatives, you've put in place a multi-pronged strategy that, you know, because pretty much I think all public health problems tend to be multifactorial. So there's never one answer to the problem. Once you can prove all of those things, the WTO regime is not going to stop you from going ahead. And really, at the end of the day, what it boils down to is, do we as Caribbean people, as Caribbean governments, have the political will that is needed to take the action as Chile has done, as Uruguay has done, as Mexico has done, Canada we hope will do? Do we have the political will to take the action that we need to take based on always evidence-based policies? And once the answer is yes, you know, the WTO rules won't be a problem. We'll be able to do what we need to do and to secure the health of our people, our nation, and more importantly, of our children. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. That was excellent. I'm going to jump right into the questions just to make sure that we are managing our time. And the first two questions come from Lucy and Dr. Virginia Aspen-Usberg, and they are related to Codex. So I'll read Lucy's first question. Is Codex being kept informed of the standard being pursued in CARICOM, Will this be considered as they move forward to produce an international standard? And regarding codex, is there any collaboration with CrossQ when it comes to Caribbean islands, or Caribbean standards rather? Is cultural appropriateness also considered in the discussions with codex?
Okay, so just quickly, my days in the Foreign Service are long gone, so I have no insider knowledge of what happens in terms of policy making these days. But I will just answer. So from the outside looking in, I will give you a response. And so in terms of codex and being informed of the CARICOM standard, to the best of my knowledge, there's been very limited CARICOM participation in the codex discussions on front of pack labeling to date. So in other words, the idea is this isn't on codex to reach out. Codex is like the UN. You go and you say what you want to say as a member state. So if you have an interest in an issue, the onus is on you as a member state to be there, to be present, to have positions, etc. And so I can't really say for sure, but certainly my understanding is, it's with the limited information that I have, that we have not been the most active. And so we would not have been, deeply engaged in many of the discussions today on front of pack labeling. That's certainly something that we can run, because as I said, we have membership within these organizations, and to the extent that we are moving ahead in the context of CARICOM with the standard, it's in our interest to make sure that we don't close off policy space in codex in terms of what it is that we want to do. In terms of the collaboration with CrossQ, once again, like I said, Codex is, CrossQ is part of CARICOM, and entity there, and Codex is their entity within the FAO WHO world. But what I will say is that certainly I know in the context of, for example, CrossQ, a lot of their work is very much based and oriented in terms of the codes. So certainly CrossQ keeps a close eye on what is happening in Codex. Member states keep, in terms of the determination that they're making within CrossQ, they will be very heavily influenced by what is happening in Codex. But like I said, unfortunately, and this is my personal view, I think that sometimes there is an over appreciation of Codex, where member states almost seem to feel like because there's a Codex standard, it means I can't do anything else, and that wasn't the intention. Oh, is cultural appropriateness considered in the discussions within Codex? So the Codex discussions are going to reflect what member states say, right? And so if there's a particular cultural context that you need to have taken account of, the onus is on you to put that cultural context. What I will say is that, much like how I've been in the context of exceptions, if you want to create exceptions to the public health policies, how they're going to be implemented, if you're really about health, cultural appropriateness or not, I don't know how powerful that can be, because we all need to live, we all want to be healthy, and it doesn't matter whether I'm living in Barbados or whether I'm living in the United States of America. It's like much the same with human rights, yeah. So we all have a right to life, and you don't get to tell me that my right to life means something different because I'm from Barbados rather than the United States. We're all human beings, and so I don't know. To be honest, how I don't think very formally it would be, but certainly to the extent that there's a particular unique perspective or issue that needs to be taken account of in terms of your local circumstances, the onus would be on the member state or member states in question to raise that and have that taken account of.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. The next question comes from Nimrod. In the wake of Brexit, how will WTO agreements impact on the OTs?
So that's a little bit outside of the scope of our, so we have a separate webinar, which is a trade webinar on OTs and Brexit. I think really that, unfortunately, even though we now have a little bit more clarity in terms of, yes, the Britain is leaving the EU, so we know that's happening as of tomorrow. I still, as you know, there's going to be this transition period, and there's anybody's guess as to what's going to be the trade agreement, hopefully that they get to negotiate in a year, in this year, or that's the transition period. And I think much of how it will impact OTs overseas territories will be dependent on details of those negotiations. So it's kind of, unfortunately, I think we're still very much in a wait and see mode in terms, because we don't know, we just know that they're leaving. We don't know, but we don't know anything more specific than that. So it's a little difficult to anticipate, in detail what would be impacts.
Okay, the next question comes from Cherise Bristol in Canada. Basically, Cherise is asking, are there any legal implications around prohibiting sponsorship of sporting events? And I'm assuming this would be by the unhealthy commodities industry.
So, okay. Now, the webinar would have spoken to the WTO rules more broadly. So looking at it just basically from a international law perspective. So we're just looking at it from the multilateral level. What do we at the multilateral level? In terms of your question, however, you would not be able to just look at the WTO rules. What you would have to do, so you would know that, okay, from a trade perspective, in terms of WTO specifically, there's nothing preventing me from taking these actions, right? But because, assuming for these purposes, of course, that we have the evidence to show that marketing is linked to the overall health problem that we have, that exacerbates it. We have evidence to show that other countries, even if not ourselves, have successfully been able to implement these types of bans and them have a positive, assuming all of those things. So even though we would know that we could take those actions then from that broad perspective of WTO, what would be really even more critical is at the domestic level, what do your laws say? So what does your constitution say? What does your constitution say? What does your rules as it relates to commerce more generally, whether it's in your commerce department or your trade department, in terms of the rules that regulate how businesses are run and all of those sorts of things. So you would have to look for each territory. You would have to look at what is the landscape, the details of the laws that you have there. But certainly, just from a WTO perspective, depending on what positions you have taken. So, for example, with services, which is what this would be, advertising, and you may have made certain commitments in the context of services, but the idea would be that you would try to justify it, as I said, as a public health exception, but that will not provide a full answer. You would have to look at whether there are any restrictions on your ability to take that type of action at the domestic level. No, nothing to do with trade. And equally as well, you would have to, so this presentation would have just spoken about the WTO rules, as I said, but remember that many of us belong to a number of bilateral and regional investment regimes. And so you would equally have to look and see whether in the context of any of your investment regimes, if there are any restrictions on the ability to put in place those types of regulations. So whether your policy space, your regulatory space has been closed off in the context of those agreements. So, for example, many of these companies are not necessarily, they're like subsidiaries. So the company that's operating in your territory may be subsidiary of a bigger company that is maybe based in the US or Switzerland or Canada or something like that. And you may have a bilateral investment agreement with Canada that speaks to how you're going to treat with their companies in your territory. And so it's sort of a overall, you have to look at the full picture. WTO is just a webinar, but it's just because so many people feel that WTO is the big bad guy and is preventing everybody from doing anything as it relates to health, that we chose to focus on the WTO regime. But many more elements that would go into the legal landscape in terms of what would impact on your ability to regulate from that point of view.
Okay, brilliant, Nicole. So the next question related to SSB taxation. One is from Christina Hall, and it goes somewhat unrelated, but a few years ago we implemented an SSB tax. Considering we still import SSBs, would we be breaching WTO measures by taxing or restricting the imported SSBs as well? All goes along with one of the public health strategies we've identified. And secondly, Dora Toussaint in Dominica, we too also implemented an SSB tax. Are we breaching WTO measures?
No. The idea is that the tax is not, certainly from my perspective, is not a problem in terms of WTO rules. The idea would be that you would be justifying it as a public health measure. And what you would have to ensure is that you have your homework in terms of, as we said, the evidence. So the evidence to justify why we're choosing. So, for example, the Heart and Stroke Foundation right now in Barbados is doing this huge campaign in terms of removing sweet beverages from school. And one of the questions we get all the time is, why SSBs? You know, there are lots of other things that are also, damaging to health. And you say, well, the evidence shows us that really, of all the unhealthy things, it's mostly SSBs that is a big part, it's the major part of the problem, and then the other things add on with that. And so the idea would be that you would justify it in the context. But first thing is, in terms, if they're imported goods, for the duties and stuff, so not so much taxes, but the duties and whatever that are coming in, we may have a little bit of space there in terms of if we're not fully implementing the amount of duty that we would have space to increase that. But in terms of the tax, once it's done in a non-discriminatory manner for public health objective, and we can clearly document and substantiate that, we wouldn't have a problem. We shouldn't have a problem. And I don't recall, there haven't really been any issues in the context of persons haven't been making noises in terms of saying that we have been non-compliant or anything like that. And actually, I think we actually had a situation where we were finding out that the tax was going domestic, but not the imported one. So if anything, they were getting a good deal. So I don't think the tax doesn't really present a challenge. The area where persons tend to think that maybe more of a challenge is the front of pack labeling. That tends to be the one that's a little bit more contentious.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. We have a few questions on FO coming up, but before we get to that, we have a very general question from Christine Bristol. How do ministries of trade, economic affairs, and health / nutrition entities collaborate to restrict low nutrient, highly processed food items in the population?
Well, I mean, the idea is that you have to get together and talk and just establish a policy, right? You have to, all the ministries need to articulate what their particular goals are. As public health professionals and policymakers, obviously your main concern is the health considerations, but then trade will come to the people in terms of saying, but no, we have a constituency too, we have business, XYZ, and you negotiate. Basically, you negotiate and you work out what is the best solution in terms of arriving at that optimal point where you can address your trade concerns but still address your public health. Or it may be that we can make a determination that one has to trump the other, and as to which one I think should trump. But you can equally, you might be able to convince your trade partners that health should trump, or they might be able to convince you that trade should trump in this particular instance. But I think much of the challenge that we have in the region is that a lot of our policy making is still done in silos. So health, does their policy, and they do it as health people, and then trade does their policy, and we don't necessarily that communication on a consistent, ongoing basis. So I would say the key to putting in place those policies is setting up some sort of committee or structure where health, trade, and other players are in constant contact and talking with each other all the time. And then from there, you can articulate a clear path forward.
Okay, Nicole. The next question comes from Stina Hall, and it's a clarification. I may be misunderstanding, but how would implementing front of pack breach the WTO rules? We often import foods from the UK who have implemented FOP labels. We have identified the long-term goals of our health ministries as well as the short-term goals, such as educating our public. But if we also consider that trade should be free, having FOPL in the Caribbean product should not restrict free trade. I think you're definitely hitting the nail on the head by saying the political will is the true reason.
There you go. I mean, the idea is, so there is some, yes, it is true that we do have a number of regimes out there. And so, it's not just CARICOM who's trying to implement something, but much of the debate has surrounded the type of scheme. So there are many different types of schemes. And so the ones that have tended to be more controversial have been the ones that have been more recently implemented by Chile, Uruguay. So the high-end warning type scheme, as opposed to the traffic light system, which is what the UK uses. And the argument there is, in terms of breaching WTO, remember the allowance in terms of public health is that it should be the least trade restrictive possible. And so the argument is that this is going to be more trade restrictive than necessary to secure the public health goal, which is why the evidence in terms of how the different systems perform is so key, because you're able to show how the high-end warning type system performs better in terms of informing consumers, empowering consumers, and helping them to shift away from these products that are high in these nutrients that we want them to sort of cut back on how much of that they get taken in.
Okay, thanks. We have a really important question coming from Kay next about evidence. If FOPL goes through as it is currently proposed in CARICOM and is challenged under TBT, will CARICOM need evidence that proves it is working to reduce NCDs? How specific do you think that evidence would need to be? Does the Port of Spain Declaration help to show that this is a legitimate policy objective? And how else could CARICOM strengthen this case?
Hi, thanks, Kay. And I think I know which Kay this is. So hi, so hello. In terms of the current proposal, so the last version of the FOPL is in an informative annex. So, it's not mine at this point. So I would have to think a little bit about what the implications of that, because technical barriers to trade are mandatory requirements. But assuming that it falls within the scope of the TBT as something that we're seeing across the board within CARICOM has to be implemented, then anything is possible. Yes, it could be challenged. The idea would be, as you're saying, that we would have to be prepared as CARICOM. So one, we should be actively participating all like now in TBT, in the discussions that are taking place in respect of Chile's and Uruguay's regimes, so that we're helping to lend support to the types of positions that they're taking, so that time is our turn, we're better able to just endorse and adopt those positions. But certainly, as you're pointing out, we would need evidence, and that's why we're saying all the time, that a multi-pronged approach is so important, because we would want to be sure, and that evidence is important. So you're absolutely correct. We would have to have evidence to show that we have an NCDs problem, which that's no problem. We have reams of evidence about that from PAHO, everybody else, the George Allen Chronic Disease Research Center. We have tons of evidence about the NCDs problem. But then the question would be, what have we been doing in the context of trying to address that problem? Are we trying to put all our eggs in one bag in terms of FOPL? Because then how effective could it be? And that's why I said equally we would have to be careful about how we framed what the objective was, because the objective couldn't be about NCDs. The objective would have to be about just empowering consumers against a backdrop of where we have a public health problem of high levels of NCDs, etc., and against a backdrop, and we have evidence of that, and against a backdrop where we know that there's certain nutrients that contribute in particular to that problem and cause obesity and the linkages there, which we would have evidence of that, then we need this suite of measures. And we will be saying, well, front of pack is one of them, but really we should be saying it's one of a suite that we're really trying to implement, so that it is key for us to continue to collect the evidence, but I think we're in a relatively good space nonetheless, because we do have quite a bit of evidence today. And in this regard, it's important to note that the evidence doesn't have to be evidence in your territory. So, for example, we haven't implemented a high-end system yet, warning system yet, because we're still discussing it in CARICOM. But Chile has, Uruguay has. We just had a study come out from Barry Pop and some others. They did the evaluation in Chile, 24% reduction in purchases. It's effective. It is clear it is effective. And what the plain packaging case showed us is exactly that. And not only plain packaging, there was also an investment dispute with Uruguay, where Switzerland sued Uruguay Morris basically in respect of the same plain packaging measures that Uruguay had put in place. And in that instance, Uruguay, the arbitral panel in that case, allowed Uruguay to rely on evidence because sometimes their studies weren't finished, or they hadn't run studies specifically on whatever particular aspect yet, but they were able to point to others who had. And the tribunal said, that's fine. The evidence doesn't always have to be 100% your experience. If there's something out there and it's valid and it's transferable, we'll accept it. And so, we need to work on more evidence, yes, but I think we're in a good place in terms of the existing evidence that is there. We have a lot of evidence about our local situation as it relates to NCDs and about what is contributing to NCDs. And then we would have lots of international evidence about the types of measures that have been effective in terms of trying to deal with those problems.
Excellent, Nicole. The next question comes from Tom. Was Uruguay's tobacco packaging undertaken through standards or Parliament? Does this seem to matter as to whether it is challenged under TBT?
No, I'm trying to remember now, to be perfectly honest. It would have been, yes, I think I am correct in saying they had legislation, but I speak a little bit subject. I would have to look back at the arbitral tribunal decision. I haven't looked at it in a while. I think I seem to recall that they passed legislation. But the idea is that it wouldn't matter whether it's a standard or once it's something that you're implementing within your territory. And remember, I said that the TBT agreement has a specific definition of a technical regulation, which are the measures that fall within the TBT agreement. So if it is a document, so you see, they didn't say a law or a standard or whatever, they said a document that sets out characteristics or processes and those types of elements that are mandatory in terms of access to your market, then it would be considered a technical barrier to trade. And from that point of view, the TBT would apply. Because remember, the WTO regime is not a domestic regime. It's an international regime. When you go to the WTO process, that's an international process. It's not that you're suing in your domestic courts. So from that point of view, it becomes irrelevant in a way what's the mechanism by which you did it. You're just saying, based on the WTO agreement, you're not allowed to restrict my access in this way.
Okay. So I've got a comment from Lucy / question. I'm assuming a WTO challenge would only come, if it does come, after countries individually legislate these standards.
Okay, so good question. So in terms of we can differentiate two scenarios. So when we say challenge will take two forms. So all right now, Uruguay and Chile have been facing consistent challenges, but in the context of the TBT committee. So when the TBT committee meets, there's an agenda item called specific trade concerns, and that head, member states are able to raise any concerns that they have in the context of actions that member states are taking that they think are problematic in terms of the TBT. So this is low level. This is not bringing a dispute. This is, I have a problem, I'm bringing it to this forum, let's discuss this. I think you're doing something that you're not allowed to do. You tell me what you think you're allowed to do. We go back and forth a little bit. It's only where then I am really dissatisfied with your response, and I have a strong stake in your market, and I really feel strongly that what you have done is in violation. Then I may decide to up the ante and carry a dispute. But we haven't had any disputes. Actually, the only which is why we have to rely on plain packaging. which is not the typical situation, which, as I said, is not always 100% identifiable with the types of measures you will be taking in relation to food, but it's the only decision that we have from that point of view, besides the broad determinations that we've had before in the WTO that health matters and, you know, all of those sorts of things. So we only have the tobacco case because nobody's actually brought a case for all that. So Chile was notified, I think, sometime in 2013 or something like that. And since then, consistently, they've been getting questions about their regime and having to defend it. And similarly, since last, I think it is when Uruguay implemented the high-end front-to-back labeling system, the last TBT meeting, they were on the fire and had to provide a response. But the idea is that this is part and parcel of, you know, that's what the committee is there for. And that's, you know, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. I mean, as Uruguay has done, as Chile has done, you articulate why you think you're correct. You know, that's the idea, that you place policies that you know you can defend. So, and that's where the checklist that I was going through in terms of the summary things to consider comes in, because you want to make sure that when you've constructed this policy, you can tick all of those boxes so that when or if it is challenged in the context of even just you being called to account in the committee, you're able to respond forcefully and in detail and confidently because you feel confident that you've done what needs done. But in terms of a challenge to, in terms of dispute settlement, until such time as, I mean, I don't know that it has to be legislated for it to be litigated, but certainly it would have, we would expect that, you know, somebody's applying it, so you're having some sort of a problem, albeit that on the WTO you can sue in respect of things in anticipation. Just looking on the face of it, you think there's a problem. But even if there wasn't legislation and we started to implement the standard, yeah, then I think you need some sort of formal action before you actually see somebody bringing an actual dispute claim in the dispute settlement.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Nicole. The next question comes from Dr. Assenusberg again. You might have spoken about this already. Basically, she's asking, are SSB school bans in breach of WTO rules?
The idea is that, so I don't know, like any good lawyer, I don't know I can say yes or no, right? It's never that straightforward, that you have to do the analysis and look at everything. But the idea would be that you could justify it. So could they be justified? Absolutely, I think they could. Because, but once again, it would be based on the types of arguments that we're making. So you would need to have had evidence of a problem that's a public health problem. You would need to have evidence of the fact that the measure that you are put in place is the most appropriate response. So they're not less trade restrictive, because that's the most trade restrictive, right? You're not like anything, you're banning them. So then the onus is really on you to prove that really the only thing that can be really effective to secure, in terms of fully securing my public health goal, is a ban. And once you have that evidence, you'll be fine. You should be fine, because the WTO allows you to take action for public health measures, and you know, in the public interest in terms of public health. But you have to be able to justify it. You have to show that that there are no reasonably available alternatives, and that it is not more trade restrictive than is needed to be to secure your public health goal. And I would suggest, certainly when it comes to our kids, I mean, the public health goal becomes even, the bar becomes even higher, because risk perhaps that we would be willing to accept in relation to ourselves or adults more broadly, I would suggest certainly we would not be willing to accept in relation to children, particularly bearing in mind their vulnerability.
Thank you, Nicole. And just a reminder from Dr. Assenusberg that FOPL is part of the 6-point policy package.
Absolutely. Very good point, yes.
Okay, so Nicole, we'd like to thank you for an excellent presentation, very thoughtful and extremely helpful for us as advocates in the region. And we would like to remind everyone to join us on our next webinar. We'll send out some information over the next month or two. And thanks again for supporting the HCC and tuning in for this webinar.
Thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to us having some really strong, proactive public health policymakers out there. Thanks.
Thank you.